Now, welcome to today's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Ak Larkwood for the second book of the Serpent Gates series, The Thousand Eyes. My name is Alex Schaffner, and I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you know our store, welcome back. It's lovely to have you again. If this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. It is wonderful to have all of you as part of our community today. Thank you so much for supporting Cassie's work and supporting an independent bookstore by being here and through buying books and tickets with us. We cannot do this work without you and your support, so we really appreciate you being here. Now, to introduce our author, Ak Larkwood studied English at St. John's College, Cambridge, and now lives in Oxford with her wife and a cat. Her writing has been featured on Den of Geek, Tor.com, and others, where she talks about such good things as Farscape, Diana Wynne Jones's Chronicles of Crestomancy, and the joys of action fantasy. And we'll be coming back to most or all of that in the very near future. The Unspoken Name was her debut, and this week we're excited to welcome the second book of the series, The Thousand Eyes. With no spoilers given, I'm just going to say that The Thousand Eyes is a sort of world-shaking follow-up to what has been a wonderfully rich and confident debut. In this book, we see a lot of familiar characters and several delightful new ones, all of them coming up against the gods once again. So I'm very happy to be here with the author today. Cassie, welcome. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. It's 9 o'clock here. I've narrowly made it here, having got held up in traffic because apparently Timothy Chalamet is filming a film in the middle of Oxford at the moment, so it's been quite busy. But yeah, no, here and delighted to be talking to you all.
How's release week been so far? I guess the book's been out for a few days at this point.
Yeah, it's weird. It's quite surreal. It's similarly to the first one coming out. Although I guess back in February 2020, the pandemic strangeness had not really kicked off so much, but it was almost the same kind of disconnected feeling because the book came out in the US first, and I'm obviously living in the UK, so it was kind of like, I guess maybe every writer feels like this when they have a book out, that it feels like this earth-shaking thing, and then actually, you go around your daily life, you go to Tesco, it's normal. But even more so, it was kind of like I'd be looking on Twitter, people would be kind of like, "Oh, interested to check out this new book," and I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm really cool and famous now," and then I'd be like, "No, here I go off to the shops, just living my normal life," and it's been, kind of that the same, but kind of nice in a way, because I knew much more what to expect and sort of felt more confident that there would be people out there who were like interested in what I was putting out there, because the reception to the first book has been really lovely and kind of. I feel less concerned that it's just going to be kind of like, I don't get this. Why is the book like this? It's weird. So, yeah.
Well, I remember the early reactions to just the announcement of the first book were so wonderful, and it's been great to see people following that initial excitement with so much love for this series. But actually, because that's come up, I wanted to ask you about one of the basic questions that one might have for this series, which is making not only an orc protagonist, but a gay orc protagonist happen in these books. And I was just wanting to ask, what set you in that direction? And when you're writing about Xorwe and all of your characters, really, what makes it different for you than if you were writing a human character, if anything?
I guess it's an interesting one, this, because there's a kind of few different ways that I find myself answering different answers depending on my mood. On the one hand, I really love writing a fantasy setting with loads of non-human peoples, and kind of just having the opportunity to kind of dip into like all the kind of very rich mythological weirdness that writing in the fantasy genre gives you access to, and that kind of feels very important to me to kind of write writing in a speculative genre to kind of to challenge my own assumptions about like what the baseline is, or kind of what the normative culture is, and so on. And I'm kind of still constantly trying to do that all the time, like with every book, kind of what assumptions am I making about the way things have to be? Do things have to be that way? Like, does that serve the story? Because the aim is definitely not to write a utopia at all, but like to think about, definitely over successive drafts of writing Unspoken Name, for instance, I in initial drafts kind of wrote this world which had some kind of like very bog standard tiresome fantasy kind of quasi historical homophobia in it, and it was kind of like I didn't really want that to be there. It wasn't something that excited me. It was just I feel like I'd never read a book with gay people that didn't have that, so I just kind of put it in out of necessity, and it was just really boring and annoying to me. I didn't like writing those parts, and then kind of early readers were like, I don't really understand why this is here because you're clearly not interested in it. And I was like, oh yeah, I can just take it out, I guess. And kind of realizing that I could move away from that like vague sense that like, oh, you know, fantasy is kind of historical, and in historical times people were kind of homophobic, both of which are not really assumptions I would have made if I'd actually thought about them, and kind of still, you know, trying to broaden my horizons in terms of like how gender is presented, and you know, all other kind of things where it's really easy to make certain assumptions because we've read so much that is rooted in a culture that makes such certain assumptions all the time. But then on the other hand, with writing the kind of non-human people in the book, and all these societies and civilizations that are kind of I guess different from each other, different from maybe the norm in kind of like traditional heroic fantasy. It's not that different because people and characterization work the same, and it's always about kind of trying to find out what makes a given point of view character think and feel and behave the way that they do, you know, kind of influenced by the world around them, but kind of that's not the whole story. So I hope that's kind of a rambling way to answer that question in two ways, but yeah.
Well, I think it connects really nicely because I think what you're saying on the one hand is why do we have to settle creatively for protagonists who fit what we see in the mirror? You know, we can move outside of that when we're talking about a world that doesn't follow a lot of our own rules, and that's how you can end up with orcs and snakes, which I would love to talk about more. But you're also saying, I think, that we can move outside of the limitations of our own cultural setting in a certain way. I mean, I think there's a degree to which you always have to respond to the cultural setting that you're a part of, that you're writing in. But I think saying something like, just because a world exists doesn't mean it has to be a homophobic world is like a pretty good use of authorial power. So.
Yeah, well, and kind of in terms of responding to genre, yeah, like always, like a big part of what I'm interested in writing and kind of what inspires me is not really subverting genre, but kind of looking at stock genre situations and characters from a different angle. So like one of the big things I wanted to do with Sorbet was that I'm always kind of interested in cartoon fantasy where you have like a bad guy that has like a fortress and he has his minions and so on. I was always kind of fascinated by what the like social milieu in that workplace would be like, or kind of what the relationship between those people would be like. And so kind of writing about like the original concept for Soy was kind of like a villain's sidekick, and kind of someone who does like the dirty work because the villain himself is too cool and hands off to do that. And so kind of, yeah, like responding to genre in terms of looking at things from an angle that I haven't seen other people do, or kind of, it just provides, it's not even so much in a kind of like, yeah, this is so fresh and different and I'm super cool and no one's ever thought of this before, but more just kind of that I find it very inspiring to be like, sometimes you can look at things from a different angle and it's suddenly a completely different take on things.
Well, I think one of the great joys of being a reader who writes is being able to, you know, stand with and on top of what's come before. And I think loving the genre is really important to that. So when you're saying like, it's not I'm new and better and different, it's a new take on something that I know very well. I think you can see a lot of that love in your books and in a lot of well-written fantasy, for exactly the reason, you know, that you have to care to really transform something. So obviously one of the aspects of your books, which I personally find very exciting in fantasy world building generally, religion is very, very, very central to these books. And I wonder if that is always sort of like a central feature for you of world building, and if every story that you come up with tends to have that as a kernel, or if it's something that came like after that concept of Xorwe and Sethanai.
Yeah, I guess it's something that I've always been really interested in, and kind of like, and not as a particularly religious person myself, but kind of like all of my siblings at various times in their lives have sung in different cathedral choirs and so on. So I've kind of like had the opportunity to witness a lot of religious practice in my life without necessarily participating in it. And I've always been quite interested in kind of, I'm not very good at research or retaining useful information, but kind of reading about world religions and kind of all the different ways in which people in all cultures kind of find ways to make life meaningful. I think that kind of the creation of meaning as a thing that humans do is very central to what I'm interested in writing about, because I think it's kind of part of what motivates storytelling as well, like the fact that we live these lives of kind of incredible and often terrible randomness, and kind of needing to find a way to reconcile yourself to that randomness, or to find a way to tell yourself a story about it that makes it meaningful, or to kind of see your present suffering or whatever as fitting into a greater pattern or whatever. I think that's it's very common to everyone, like whether religious or not. And I'm also very interested in institutions, like, again, kind of, I think in myself generally mildly to moderately suspicious of authority at all times, but have a very, like, I spent quite a lot of my youth living within a school that my parents worked at. So sometimes I was at that, like attending that school as a student, and at times not, but kind of always like seeing the establishment with this, all the staff and everyone who worked there and so on, kind of both from the inside and outside, and got very interested in the kind of like the way that like status and hierarchy and different traditions and customs and clashes of ideas about how those things ought to work, even within something pretty mundane like a secondary school. I find that really fascinating, and I think that talking about religious institutions is very interesting, because you end up with the clash of things that are very kind of enormous and numinous and kind of deeply meaningful about kind of life and death and existence, coming into contact with extremely petty human things like kind of like who's more important, who gets to wear a cool robe, who gets to sit first at a high table or what have you. And I think the kind of contrast between those two things, A, is very funny to me, and B, I think kind of says something genuinely profound about like what we're like as people, that kind of we are capable of caring a lot about both like enormous philosophical questions and also whether you get to sit first at high table. Like, it's very possible for those things both to matter a lot to a person. And I find that very fun to think about. So again, I don't know if that's really answered the questions, but those are some of my random thoughts on religion and writing fantasy.
Very good thoughts. I do think it's interesting, sort of harkening back to you saying, authority is questionable. We see a lot of religion, we see a lot of different religions adhering to different gods in these books, and most of them are very scary, which I think is interesting. We don't see a lot of benevolent godhood. Is that something that is likely to come up in future books, or is this sort of like a persistent sort of angle on deities that you think will continue?
I don't know. I guess it'll depend on what the needs of the story are. I think kind of I think a lot about how to portray religion in the books, because there's a few ways things can be done that I really don't like. So I kind of had a couple of pitfalls that I particularly wanted to avoid. First of all, being kind of like any sense of kind of like, well, there's these kind of like violent and scary religions that are kind of vaguely coded as being kind of non-Christian or pagan or whatever, and then we have a like nice loving religion that's vaguely coded as being Christian, and I kind of like super did not want to do that at all, because it's so boring. And so like such a misreading of how anything works in the real world. But I also kind of wanted to avoid, like, I love weird stuff and I love terrible gods and I love kind of hundreds of skeletons and snakes and things, but I kind of wanted to avoid having a belief system that people subscribe to en masse that kind of didn't make sense. Like if you have like Cthulhu cultists or whatever, where it's kind of like all these people worshipping a god which is only kind of destructive and ruins their lives, and there's nothing, it's kind of hard to see why anyone would subscribe to that, because like what kind of sense of meaning or anything does it give you? Like, even with kind of like the cult of the unspoken, which is kind of a quasi death cult skeleton guy, I think at least what I wanted to try and do was to kind of make it very clear that there is a kind of way in which that practice lends structure and meaning and some kind of like even beauty or understanding to the lives of the people who are worshipping that god, even if it's also kind of like, yes, and now also you have to sacrifice a child to me. I think I've forgotten what the question was, but
that's okay. Well, I think the unspoken is actually a great example of where you do fit a lot of nuance and interest into the way that you're writing about these, even when, for the sake of the adventure of the story, the god is kind of scary. What happens with the practitioners is interesting. I like what you said about basically about there needing to be something rational to people subscribing, and I think the Cult of the Unspoken is a perfect example, because it offers the future, and it offers a sense of control over death, and insecurity, and both of those things are like such essential human fears, that okay, maybe not for all of us is sewing our lips shut and exsanguinating ourselves, but in terms of like what the god is offering, I think that makes perfect sense. And we see a lot of sort of moral variability within the people who follow that religion. So I think what you're saying is something that's really well carried out through the books.
Oh, thank you. Well, that makes me feel like I achieved what I set out to do.
Absolutely. So I think one thing that, of course, sets a lot of fantasy apart from some others' experiences is that the gods are extraordinarily hands-on. They show up in living form on a daily basis. They talk directly into your heads, and have relics and bring the dead back to life, walking around in your basement and so on. So lots of things going on. Did you realize that in these books they were going to be such active characters? I mostly say because there's sort of this sense of death and ancientness and pastness about the gods, and then they just will not go away. They are very present. So did that surprise you?
Yeah, honestly, it did kind of surprise me, because my original conception for the way divinity was going to work in this setting was that it was going to be very tied to place and very kind of inhuman is not quite the right word, because there aren't any humans in the book, but like not kind of operating on the level of like squishy people walking around. And that kind of was very fun to work with for a while, and then it was kind of like, oh, but there's a lot of cool stuff I could do if I let them be a bit more present and let them do a bit more. And so I just kind of I think there's such a thing as clinging on to an original concept for too long and letting it stop you doing cool stuff. So and I wanted it to be a setting that could like grow and change and try to not be afraid to break my toys too much. So it is. I think that's really astutely identified as a big difference between the first book and the second one, actually, that kind of divine intervention happens a lot more in the second book, for good or ill. And it was very fun to do, and also kind of a characterization challenge, because how on earth to give a kind of a meaningful characterization to an entity which doesn't have kind of wants or goals that are in any way I mean, like maybe comprehensible, probably not relatable.
Yes. Yeah, the presence of the gods in the second book is very related but very different, and very exciting. So for those who have not had a chance to start the book yet, you are looking forward to some, shall I say epic? I will. Some epic adventures. Lots goes on, and it's very exciting. On sort of a more intimate level, I think for a lot of people, the most engaging part of this series is the changing dynamic between Xorwe and Shuthmeli. And I want to go back to the first book again and ask you what it's like to write these two characters, because they essentially start from the same position. Like, one of them knows that she's a sacrifice, the other hasn't quite come to terms with the fact that that's basically what she's being asked to do. But they start in similar positions and arrive at similar positions, but they're completely different people. So how did you go about approaching those differences?
Yeah, it's for once I have a quite straightforward answer on this, which is that I completely knew what I wanted to do with Soy, and then Shazmili was kind of, at least for the first book, written to be someone who was in a similar position but felt differently about it. And I think kind of one of the things that, especially in the first book, but kind of at all times, I'm quite interested in writing about is the ways in which people end up feeling very committed emotionally to situations that are not obviously in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of, it's one of those things where I wouldn't say I love it in real life, because it leads to a lot of unhappiness and awfulness. But kind of in terms of writing, I think it's one of the most fascinating things to write about, is how people end up committed to worldviews or relationships or kind of personal goals that are actually really not good for them or necessarily for anyone. But almost the more you commit to it, the less you can kind of see that. And I think exploring how different people kind of break away from or fail to break away from those situations is like one of my favorite things to write about. So writing about Xorwe and Shithmili both being kind of like, oh, it's fine that I'm gonna like surrender my personhood because that's what my society expects from me. Move to, actually, maybe I'm not going to do that. That sounds bad. It was very fun to write about how they kind of both came to that conclusion from, or kind of both kind of navigate that issue from different perspectives and from very different personalities.
Yeah, they are very different people, which is a lot of fun. I think I almost made a statement about what Xorwe is like, and then I disagreed with myself, because she's very complex, because she's incredibly loyal and determined and steadfast. But once she has made up her mind about something, she will just turn course and go just as loyally and steadfastly in that direction that she's chosen. Which is really the only reason that the books can happen the way they do, is that she sort of sets a target and walks towards it, with great intensity, and will go through a lot to get to her end goal. And Shwethmili is actually similar in that way, where sort of she's decided something is right, and she puts years of work into it and is able to walk away. But you get a different sense about like what it is that they value or take away from the religions and the communities that they've left. So they manage such a lot of distinction between them, despite some of those similarities. I want to ask about a couple narrative things. I promised that I would ask about a couple of the things that you have written about elsewhere. And first, I really want to ask tangentially about Farscape. First of all, Farscape is a wonderful show, which maybe you could briefly describe, because I think lots of people don't get the chance to see it, which is too bad, but true.
Yes, it is true. Farscape is a very strange, I guess, early 2000s, but I might be wrong about that, space opera show about an allegedly normal Earthman called John Crichton, who for reasons, is propelled through a wormhole into the completely bizarre other side of the universe, which is populated by this incredibly bizarre variety of different peoples and aliens and planets and monsters and wildlife and evil plots. And it does that thing that I love, the thing that I love the most, where the villain from one season, having been defeated, will join the team and then have to, like, in a kind of salty way, help them defeat the villain of the next season. Oh, it's great. It rules. I mean, it's quite dated in some ways, but also in other ways I wholeheartedly recommend it. Like,
nothing else has really done what it's done. Like, nobody has come back and topped it, like, really, in what it is doing.
I honestly think, in terms of the kind of aesthetics, is maybe the wrong word, because it makes it seem like I think everyone should be wearing full rubber face masks and living in a quarry in Australia, which is not true. But kind of the wildness of it, like the fact that it doesn't take itself seriously in terms of being too afraid to do weird stuff, but it doesn't take itself unseriously in terms of constantly feeling like it needs to undercut what it's doing, because, like, oh, it's so silly, we're all Australian and living in this quarry. It's so great. And I think I revisited, like, the first half of it quite recently, and I was really struck by all the stuff that I watched when I was a teenager and quite embarrassed by how goofy it was, like, really hit differently as someone where I feel like my critical tastes have been sort of slightly wrung out a bit more, where it's kind of like, actually, the goofiness of this is kind of veiling something quite profound about how much the first season is about the coexistence of all these different ways of being in space. And the solution is so rarely about violence or about one worldview having to win out. And I think that's kind of, the storytelling becomes kind of more coherent and more character focused as the series go on. And I think in so, like, I remember being told that, like, oh, season 3 and 4 are the best and you just have to get through the first couple of seasons to get to that. And it's kind of like, I can see why people thought that, because I think they do get on some, like, interesting mirrored character arc stuff in later seasons that's very fun. But I think that the kind of, like, fantasia of it all in the first couple of seasons is just so much, it's so great. I excuse me, I pretty much wholeheartedly recommend it. It's very good.
I would agree with all of that, and the reason I bring this up is that I feel like the specific mechanics of your books are pure fantasy, but a lot of the narrative structures and some of the trappings, like the gates, feel so space operatic. And I think it's really interesting that you managed to create the sense of something like a space opera in something that really can't be categorized as science fiction. And I wonder if any of that was deliberate, or whether you feel that that's resonant, or if I'm just coming up with something from nowhere.
No, that makes me so happy to hear, because it was 100% intentional. Like, not very much about how I write anything is 100% intentional, because normally I just go off vibes a lot. We'll just kind of do stuff and see how it seems and then rewrite it, and then that's why I have to write 7 drafts per book or whatever. But the introducing some space opera elements was 100% intentional, and it was very much born out of me thinking, like, trying to write science fiction or trying to write pure space opera and being like, oh, I can't actually do this because I love to have magic, and I love to have human sacrifices, or orcish sacrifices, as we ended up having, I guess. But also I felt a bit limited by writing, like, a fantasy setting where we just have to go from point A to point B, and if I want to have, like, a cool mountain range, I have to be like, oh, I guess there's a cool mountain range here now, like, forever.
Yes, you'll be looking at the same pale sky for the next 2 months.
Yeah, I'm kind of living in fear of someone being like, well, it's actually not very accurate to have a marsh here because you wouldn't have one. And I'm like, oh, but I really wanted one just for a bit.
They have one, it's fine.
So wanting to, and also the fact, I think that when I was writing it, I'd kind of been through, like, a bit of a sort of creative downturn and was quite, like, glum about what I wanted to write, like whether there was any point trying to write stuff. And then I kind of had this great experience reading some contemporary space opera stuff, and just, like, really loving it and really, like, feeling very creatively energized by it. Like I'm thinking specifically of like all of Yoon Lee's work. The first one in the series is Nine Fox Gambit, and I wholeheartedly recommend. It's so good. And then also like Ancillary Justice, which like everyone knows is good. And I think the last Ian M. Banks culture novel came out sadly after he died, I think, which was like a series that I'd really loved as a teenager and then kind of let go for a while. And then the last book came out and I thought, well, I feel really sad about how there's going to be no more of these, so I'm going to read it, and I absolutely loved it. That's called The Hydrogen Sonata, I think. And just kind of all of that, kind of what all of those books have in common, they're very different stories with very different tone and focus and like level of character versus kind of grandeur and spectacle. But they all have a kind of like energy in terms of moving around between different settings and kind of not spending any longer in any one place than we need to, and so on. And I thought it would be fun to try and take some of that like energetic pacing and kind of I can't quite think what I'm trying to say here, but to take some of that energy and kind of bring it to a fantasy setting, I thought would be very fun. So I'm glad to hear that it seems to have worked.
Absolutely. And that's in terms of narrative, and also sort of in terms of things like geography, where, as you say, you can spend 2 months in one mountain range. But this sort of allows you to take a galactic view of a magical setting. And it doesn't feel, I mean, that's true of something like Portal Fantasy, sure, but this doesn't feel like Portal Fantasy. It feels like Galactic Expressways, but magical. So you get to go to all of these different worlds.
Well, and like really I found that very freeing as well, in terms of like the world that I live in, that I've lived in for my whole life, is very globalized. And like, actually, either if I'm going to be trying to write something that's in a place in a setting that's not like that, it's either going to be like very shallow and pastiche, or I'm going to have to think really hard about it. And I'd rather think really hard about like cool stuff that could happen. So I like, when a previous novel that I was working on that will I hope never see the light of day, it was very bad, it was about partly werewolves, was in a very traditional fantasy setting, and I spent so long, like every time I mentioned a plant, like googling it to be like, oh, did this originate in Europe, or is this from the Americas, or what? Because I've so many times read people having really boring arguments on the internet about whether it was okay that potatoes are in Lord of the Rings or whatever, and I'm just I had some conversations with people where it was kind of like, who cares? Like, what? Who is to say that any imaginary world has the same kind of like botany or colonial history or geography as the world that we currently live in? Like, you can just do what you want. I mean, hopefully in a somewhat thoughtful way, but like you don't have to feel entrapped by trying to go for some idea of accuracy that is mostly drawn from reading strangers' arguments on the internet that don't matter. So yeah.
I did actually, speaking of potatoes, I did actually want to ask you about we have the gates and we have the gods and we have, the basic species that we're working with. But I'm always interested in sort of some of the material world building in people's books as well, because I think you can write one thing about a fantasy religion and it will inform everything else about that culture. But I also think that that's true of like one plate of food. So I'm curious about how you came up with cuisine in particular. Anything, but I think cuisine is a good one to look at.
Yeah, and I love writing about food, like, because I love cooking. Like, it's probably like my second best activity after writing, I guess. And I love like reading new recipes and learning about like there's not like very many things where I feel like I have like a sports anime protagonist intensity about, but I think that like fantasy writing and like like caramelizing onions are like the two things. So I always enjoy thinking about fantasy cuisine, because I think also kind of like with food, I would always hear this writing advice that was kind of like, oh, don't talk about food and clothes too much, nobody cares. And it's like, you're wrong, everyone cares.
Not sure everybody cares. They notice if you don't talk about those things.
Yeah. and especially with food, I think kind of because it informs so much about how the spaces in which characters interact, and kind of, you know, like cooking and agriculture and like dining customs, and kind of I always joke that my favorite type of scene to write is like a fancy dinner party where someone gets murdered, which is kind of a joke, but also kind of actually true, because I think you have so much that you can do there with kind of like sensory detail and like status and hierarchy, and who's being subtly snubbed, and like how people are kind of using this occasion to further their goals and so on, but also kind of how people can use like food and cooking as a way of expressing their like affection and care for each other. I think that's all kind of, it's just very layered. Like, I think it's a very simple and understandable way of getting into a lot of different, like you can basically do a cooking or like fancy meal scene to do anything really. Like, I think it's just very a useful one to get in there if you can. And just kind of like, yeah, same with all material culture, I guess. But I think also with the cuisine, in terms of like the actual specifics of it, I feel like I could have been a lot more systematic and thorough than I actually was, because I'm not very systematic and thorough about anything. Like, I definitely did not like rigorously world build the agriculture of any of these cultures. It was, again, mostly on vibes, or mostly on like, if I was writing a scene, I would be like, oh, I really want some noodles, so I'd just be like, I'm gonna have them eat some noodles. Yeah. Or there are some specific places, like there's a, okay, I'm gonna have to remember which scenes actually were in and which were cut from the first book, because there is a very beloved to me scene of Xorwe and Shithmili going to basically like a motorway service station and getting like deep fried food to eat, which Shithmili has never had before because she's lived a sheltered life. And sadly that had to be cut because there wasn't really space for it. But I like to think it happened off screen. But the scene where they go to the cafe and they eat pastries is based on a real place, which is a Lebanese deli in Oxford that I have been going to since I was like 7 years old, and is very dear to me, which is, if you're ever in Oxford, Albies in Summertown, really highly recommend. They're really nice people and the food is all amazing. So like that kind of scene of them eating the pastries is like, those were the pastries I was imagining. The pistachio fingers, really good. I can't remember what the question was now.
Oh, it was just, how did you come up with food? So I think you answered it beautifully.
Yeah.
There was one other influence that I wanted to talk about, which is that I found that you had written a piece on Witch Week by Diana Wynne Jones. And the question isn't really about Witch Week per se. When I first read The Unspoken Name, I got to the end, and there's an obvious reason this might be true, but this wasn't the only reason it was true. I got to the end and I was like, that's House Moving Castle. So, and looking back, there were a few places where I thought, actually, as author influences go, I can see where this possibly was there. So I would love to ask you about your brief thoughts, not all of the thoughts you have, because I don't think anyone can have thoughts about Diana Wynne Jones and sum them up in 2 minutes. But your thoughts about her and how she may be an influence in your writing.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my God, no, I can definitely go on for more than 2 minutes about that. She was pretty much my favorite writer, kind of tied with Ursula Le Guin maybe, and also I had a really big Red Wall phase when I was a kid, and kind of continues to be someone that I reread a lot, and continue to like, every time I go back to those books, I feel like there's something else to think about. Just really impressive, actually. Like there's a lot of, she wrote a lot over a very long career, and it's really nice to see how her ideas like continue to evolve and change from like early days to later days. Like the Chrestomanci series, for instance, she wrote like, over like 30 or 40 years, like not all at once, but sort of would keep kind of going back to that well. And kind of, I think it's really interesting how with like, there's like 3 or 4 books in that series that are about like a kid who's got some magic powers going to a weird castle and getting into some scrapes, and yet with each one of them it's a different take on that same basic situation, and it's doing something slightly different, saying something slightly different about kind of like mostly about power, but also about kind of class and isolation and so on, and just but again in a very kind of like extremely light touch kind of way. Like I think that's one of the most impressive things about her writing, is how there's so much going on, but it's always kind of like they're children's books in a very good way, where they're very fun and very entertaining all the time, and you never feel like you're being preached to in the slightest, and yet you come away with all of these cool thoughts about cool stuff. It's great. In terms of my work, I actually think that Lives of Christopher Chant is my favorite book of hers, and probably the most influential on The Unspoken Name and Thousand Eyes, because excuse me, it's very late here. It's a book about a lonely kid who's a wizard, who has access to this multiverse where he can go wherever he wants and have these incredible adventures. And I like really vibed with it when I was like, I wasn't a lonely kid because I have loads of siblings apart from anything else, but kind of I was quite withdrawn, and I used to just read a lot and not really do very much. So the idea of like having these secret worlds that you could like retreat into like really appealed to me, and kind of the idea of having a multiverse that's connected by a weird physical space that's kind of bleak and rocky and bizarre to navigate. I reread Lives of Christopher Chant after The Unspoken Name came out, and I was like, oh my god, this is so similar, I didn't even realize. And also in that book there is the kind of idea of if you're a smart child that's quite isolated, how easy it is to accidentally fall in with people who do not have your best interests at heart. Like, I don't really want to spoil Lives of Christopher Chant for people, because it's really, really good, and I would highly recommend reading it if you haven't before. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that the mentor character in that is, well, one of the mentor characters in that is quite evil.
She's really good at writing adults who are bad.
Yes,
adults.
She is.
She's
amazing.
Very comfortable with the idea that your family might be awful, which I think can sometimes be refreshing.
So much so, yeah, and often an awful in very both in very plausible ways and in very like supervillain ways, and often both. And I think she has such a good access to the like tremendous feeling of injustice when you're a child, that like nobody I think it's quite difficult as an adult to kind of remember what that's like in some ways, that feeling of kind of like, I feel like a person, I feel like I have my own agency and my own ideas about how I want things to be, and I have absolutely no control over what happens to me, and nobody is interested in my perspective on things at all. And I think she kind of speaks to that really well.
I think in 8 Days of Luke is one where she does that just like phenomenally well.
Yes, I have that on my bedside table at the moment, because I'm planning to reread that as a little treat. Yes, she has an amazing horrible meal scene as well. Like, I think all the time about the awful meals in 8 Days of Luke, which is, again, if people listening haven't read it, it's a book about a boy who has a horrible family that's really nasty to him, and he meets a cool friend who turns out to be like the Norse god Loki, but reborn as a child, and they become great friends and wreak a variety of havoc. It's really good. Like,
it's phenomenal.
Like, it's really good. Yeah,
that's Diana Wynne Jones. My last thought on Diana Wynne Jones, because I think this is really interesting. One thing that she said, a couple points in writing, perhaps more in life, was that to make a novel, she couldn't have an idea. She needed to have 2 or 3 big ideas that she's found could somehow fit together, which I think is fascinating. And I found it works really well. When you're looking at a really good book, you can often see those ideas. And most people don't put them together the way that she would put them together. But you can see that being true. Do you think that's true of your books? And do you have a sense of what those big ideas could be sort of like narrowed down to?
I don't know. I mean, for me, it's usually that I have like a kind of sea of like 6 or 7 or 10 cool kind of big thoughts like swimming around in a bucket. And then kind of every time I'm like, something needs to be in this story, I'm just going to go and see what I can get out of the bucket. And then I'll drag out whatever it is and kind of see if it sort of will slosh around in whatever I already have going on, and see if it kind of fits in naturally. And sometimes I'll be like, yeah, this is great, this is working. And then I'll write like 10,000 words and I'll be like, no, it's not working at all. Which is why, I mean, I've joked a lot about going back to my editor being like, you'll be pleased to know that I've put back in the plot point where everyone's covered in psychic moss. And I imagine her being like, okay. And then the psychic moss, like there is no psychic moss in Thousand Eyes anymore, I'm very sorry to say, but I'm sure it'll be making an appearance somewhere else because I did just put it back in the bucket. It seemed like a really good idea at the time, and I now see that it was completely insane, but
it sounds wonderful though. It does sound very, very good.
But I don't think I think that sort of the maybe the like romantic tension of anything that happened in Thousand Eyes might have been slightly undermined by everyone being covered in psychic moss, maybe not. But in terms, I mean, I'm amazed that Diana Wynne Jones said that about her work, because the thing I'm always impressed by is how there's always kind of like 100 cool things going on, or like I'm always amazed by, I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but kind of how she always manages to have more going on and interacting in weirder ways. Like, especially thinking about, I really love her books that kind of completely turn inside out from what genre they are when they start to what they turn out to be in the end. Like her novel Hexwood, I think, is one of the most impressive on this front. Like, it's not a perfect book, but it's really weird, and nothing else does the same thing. And it's so
my
kind
favorite
of
one of her books.
It's just like, yeah. I don't really want to spoil it in case anyone hasn't read it, but just like, no, I can't say anything. There's nothing you can say.
No,
but
everything about it is a secret, and it just unravels into something weirder and weirder and better. So yeah.
There's an absolutely incredible scene in that book, which I think about all the time, because I think it really encapsulates a lot of what's great about her writing, where, is it a spoiler to say that there's like an evil supervillain enchantress who's maybe from space, but we don't know, and she, for plot reasons, ends up sitting in like a horrible modern English pub, waiting for something to happen, and we know all about her at this point in this scene. We know all about her kind of horrible past and all of the like atrocious things she's participated in, and the kind of the like enormous like glamour and drama of her life. And she's sitting in this like beefeater, like she has these jade nail covers that are kind of part of her cool regalia, and she's just sitting like tapping them on like a branded beer mat. And it's just this moment that's very briefly evoked but incredibly vividly, and it's just like this tiny detail that tells you that kind of like brings into this incredible contrast like everything that's going on in that story. Oh, it's so good. It's really great.
Yes, people should read that book. You should read all of those books. They're just wonderful. Many of them are out print in the US, but you can get them on biblio.com, which is what I usually do. Let's see. So I have a question about reading and writing in general. By the way, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box and I'll make sure to see it. And while I'm in the chat, I will note that Leanne says, I've got 40 odd WGT Diana Wynne Jones books in arm's reach right this second, so I totally get that. Same, nice. Leanne, same.
I don't have most of mine anymore because, like I said, I have loads of younger siblings, so they all got claimed and taken away, and so the collection is very divided up. So I'd quite like to have them back, but I don't think there's much chance of that, so probably gonna have to rebuy.
So yes, writers, also readers. This is what we're discovering. I feel like scheduling is a problem with which most people deal with. So when do you do your writing and when do you do your reading?
Good question. I mean, I think before pandemic, I would have had a very clear answer on this, which was that for most of the time I was writing Unspoken Name, I had a very fixed routine, which basically was like I had my day job, which was kind of demanding in terms of time, but not very like psychically demanding, as in I would like never think about it when I wasn't there. So I would go and do my job, and I would maybe like read on the bus to my job. And then at my lunch hour, I'd write like 500 words, and then I'd do the afternoon of my job. And then I'd go sit in the canteen afterwards and I'd write another 500 words. And then I'd go home and I'd read on the bus home, or like listen to music and think about my writing. And then when I got home, I would like see my wife and feed my cat and do stuff that I needed to do. And that kind of worked pretty well for a while. And then working on book 2, it all kind of happened at once, in that I'd sort of assumed that writing was going nowhere. So I sort of thought about, I've kind of always been interested in the law. Maybe I should think about changing career, and I could retrain as a lawyer, and I can do a part-time course at the university down the road, and that'll be another option if like I can't get anywhere with writing. And then it turned out I really loved the law and was like, had the best time of being educated that I've ever had. And then also sold my book. So it was like, oh, I guess I'm doing two things now. So I've kind of carried on my legal training while also writing book two. So I would be going to university, and I would have my university days, and then I would have my writing days. And on the writing days, I would take myself to a cafe in town which has a basement. And in the basement, you can't get internet, and it smells very weird. It's very cold. But I would take my laptop and plug it in, and I would sit in the very cold, weird smelling basement, and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to write 2,000 words and then leave. And because the basement wasn't very fun, but also had no distractions, that would get done every day that I was there. So I don't know that powering through a book that fast, especially, I mean, for a first draft, it kind of worked, but I don't think it was as readable a first draft as it could have been if I hadn't been doing it that way. But that also kind of worked. And I don't think I read very much because I was reading so many like cases and law textbooks and stuff at that time. And then pandemic happened, at which point I immediately stopped doing any writing or reading whatsoever because I was too busy being sad, which was quite surprising to me because when the first lockdown happened, I was kind of like, oh, great, I'll be able to like finish the second draft of my book. This is like, it's not great, obviously, but like I've always wanted to have more time to focus on creative projects in a quiet way, and actually it sucked. It was awful. Like not being able to, or like not being legally allowed to go and sit on the bus and listen to music and go to a place, it turns out was very creatively hindering because I had not really bargained for how much like interstitial time and thinking and conceptualizing a cool sword fight I would be doing like while going about my day. And now kind of we still have some COVID restrictions in the UK, but they're kind of, who knows, try not to think about it too much. But I am working a day job which requires a lot of thought, and which I really, really enjoy, but it's very demanding. And so I'm still kind of trying to find ways to make space and time for writing while also kind of giving as much to the day job as I would want to. And we'll see. I'm sure there will be a way eventually because I am writing another book, so it's just maybe going to take a while. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded way of just kind of like, I think every single time another factor changes in life, it's kind of like, how do I fit in these things that are really important to me? And yeah, I'm sure it's always going to be that way. So we'll see.
Well, speaking of book two, this is going to be an absolutely spoiler-free zone. But we get a lot of some familiar faces back in some new and exciting ways. We also get a couple of really wonderful new characters. If you wanted to share anything about any of them, particularly Sareg, I would love to hear a brief introduction from your perspective.
Well, Sareg is a character who is very dear to me, and kind of they were a very interesting character to conceptualize and write. I think a lot has been said about the kind of like quasi sibling relationship between Soy and Tal in the first book, and I kind of see a similar thing between Tal and Sareg in that I'm the oldest of a lot of siblings, and I think kind of part of becoming an adult and definitely becoming the person that I am, not necessarily for everyone, I guess, but is kind of navigating the feeling of responsibility for people who are younger than you, and that kind of you start out in life being very reliant on the people around you and kind of being kind of molded by them or kind of taking your cues from them in a lot of ways. And then I think kind of that point in life when you realize that actually someone else is relying on you or someone else is taking their cues from you, and kind of you have that like quite scary in some ways kind of responsibility to try and like not fuck up on that was something I was interested in exploring, and especially with their relationship with Tal, because he's someone where his whole personality in a way is founded on the fact that he's always been the underdog and he's always been undervalued by everyone around him who has more power than he does, and to then suddenly become responsible for someone who is in a position of much less power than him and who's kind of even more clueless than he is kind of an opportunity for growth for him, and also kind of a way for him to a way for him to wrestle with aspects of his past that he maybe doesn't want to think about. So that was very fun. And the other thing that was interesting about Sarek was that I always, when I first imagined them, I always kind of conceived them as a non-binary character, and like I really wanted to write them that way, but I was kind of very terrified that I would not do a good job. So I was kind of like, I'm just gonna not, it's fine. I'll just make them some gender. And I wrote it that way, and it kind of like it wasn't quite right. And
thank you for not making them some other gender.
Well, I kind of, I don't know, it was partly because like several people very dear to me in life kind of came out as non-binary, or kind of I'd had like deep chats about gender with and so on, and I was kind of like, no, this is actually really important to do this the way that I always wanted to do, and maybe it's not going to be perfect, but you know, how else am I possibly going to learn how to do things better? So I wanted to make the effort, and like luckily well, and kind of, you know, as they should in a way, kind of everyone who was involved in also making the book happen was really positive and kind of like encouraging about that. So that was very good and a good learning experience for me. Although I will say, if you ever write a whole book and have a character with one set of gender pronouns and then you're like, oh, I don't like this, I'm going to change it, it's so annoying to go through and change them all. It takes ages. And I'm still kind of like, oh my god, did I get them all? But yeah, no, that was they were a very fun character to write, and I think like one of the things I enjoyed the most about working on the second book.
Well, they're a wonderful character, and this book opens up so many of the characters that we have run into previously in really new and interesting ways. So yeah, if anybody has not yet had a chance to start this book, you're going to have such a wonderful time. And it's very exciting, very big, just in terms of its scope and its content, and like physically not small.
It is slightly shorter than the first one, though, I will say.
It is. Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and I'm really excited for everybody to read it. That does actually bring us right to the end of our hour. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here and speaking with me and with us today. It's been wonderful to chat.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It has indeed been great. Really nice to talk about so many things, and like nice to find a kindred soul in terms of Farscape and the Chrestomancy books. So
anytime. Well, thank you all so much for being here today, and have a wonderful rest